Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be answering a very often asked question, which is which effects should come first? Probably one of the most frequently asked versions of this is what should come first, EQ or compression? I just got a question that was written in very recently. Someone was asking me whether compression or saturation should come first. But there's so many different effects you could think about in this way. Wait a second. With EQ and reverb, I'm always telling you in this podcast, EQ your reverbs. Should the EQ come before we hit the reverb or after we're returning from the reverb? Because both of those options exist. And there's so many more things we could ask. Should compressors come before limiters or limiters before compressors? What about de-essers? Do those come before or after compressors? And how do you remember all this stuff if there even is a right answer for some of these? And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through all the big ones, but I'm not just going to give you a list of things to memorize. I'm going to give you today in this podcast episode a set of principles, a conceptual framework you can use so that you yourself can come up with the right answer to this question every single time. This one is actually inspired by an audience question that came in. A fella named Eric wrote in to say, I wanted to say thanks for the Compression Breakthroughs course and for answering my question in the live Q&A. I've learned a lot from both. And the cheat sheet document you include in the course has made all of my sloppily handwritten notes superfluous. It really is a helpful course. And after going through the entire thing, I still have two final compression questions. All right, let's address them now. His first one here, it's a little long, so I'm just going to paraphrase. He's talking about recording guitars straight in and then using an amp simulator. And he records without pedals, but he wants to know, should I be putting a compressor pedal or stompbox effects on before the guitar signal even hits the amp simulator, or putting on a compressor, an LA2A or an 1176 after the amp simulator do just as well? Is there a benefit to compressing before or after an amp? And then his second one is extremely closely related. He says, saturation or compression first? I usually think of compression as more central to the sound of the mix than saturation, so I apply saturation second. But if I understand it correctly, he writes, saturation can round off peaks. So does it make sense to put it first so the compressor has to work less hard? Or is it better to compress first to get a saturation sound that's more consistent? These are great questions, and in his second question here are the seeds to the answer to his own question. So I'm going to give you my take on that, whether you should compress or saturate first, EQ or saturate first, EQ or reverb first, where you should put your de-esser, etc. Let's get into it in some detail. The only thing we have to do before we get into it, because we're going to go deep and we're going to go long and answer all these questions, is the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors to help keep this podcast free. And the most important sponsor that helps keep this podcast free is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Your likes and your thumbs ups and your subscribes help. So do your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. But really the most important thing that you can do to sponsor this podcast is sponsor yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Compression Breakthroughs, which will teach you to hear and learn to use compressors better and with greater confidence than ever before. Check it out with a 30-day money-back guarantee at Compression Breakthroughs. Or if you want a whole system to mixing, you can check that out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Last but not least, if you want to know everything that I know about mastering, you can check out the full-length course on mastering called Mastering Demystified at masteringendemystified.com. All right, we're just about to the end of the sponsor section. The last thing I got to do is give the briefest of shout outs to our brand sponsors. We've got Focusrite sponsoring once again. I'm speaking into a lovely Claret interface right now. They make some of the best values in interfaces out there, and all of them come with the Hitmaker expansion bundle, which comes with all of the plugins you need to make great sounding records. You've got mixing channel strips, mastering channel strips, an amazing reverb, vocal tuning program, amp simulators, drum samples, the whole nine. So definitely check out Focusrite, everything they make from the entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to the high-end RedNet series over at Focusrite.com. Speaking of plugins, check out some of my favorite plugins ever made over at soundtoys.com, where you can try out anything they make for free for 30 days. Some of the best creative mixing effects out there. Last quick shout out, something free for you if you want it. It is GPU Audio. They are giving away a free convolution reverb. Right now, you can get limited time early access over at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop, where you can get a great sounding convolution reverb for free that runs on the GPU in your computer. All right, and with that brief sponsor shout out section out of the way, here you are, the rest of the totally free full-length podcast episode. And I'll start with Eric's question that he wrote in about compression or saturation, which of those to come first. And then we'll get into EQ before or after compression, limiting before or after compression, and then a whole bunch of other effects. We'll look at de-essers, we'll look at reverbs, and a whole bunch more. But this is a good question, and Eric has practically answered it here for himself. The biggest thing to think about when it comes to saturation and whether you compress before and after saturation, in my opinion, is whether you want really consistent saturation or not. Imagine a guitar player playing into an old school tube amp. That it can be a somewhat dynamic system. If we're talking about like old school blues or rock music where guitar player digs in harder and you actually get more breakup, more distortion because there's more level going in to the amplifier. And now the tubes are starting to break up more. So you get this kind of sound that changes in character, that changes a little bit in shape and tone and envelope, depending on how hard that guitar player is digging in. And that saturation or distortion that a guitar amp is applying gives some compression of its own, notably reducing peak levels relative to average levels, but that's not all that it does. And this kind of dynamic tonal feedback can be desirable. And you can sometimes hear this too on more old school records on just something as simple as a vocal compressor, where a singer really starts belting out and the compressor clamps down harder. And in some cases, some of this old analog hardware actually starts saturating or maybe soft clipping a little bit more as the singer starts belting louder. So you have this varying tone because the signal is not really compressed before it's hitting the elements that do saturating. Is that desirable? And whether or not that is desirable is what's going to give you the answer to your question. A slightly more modern approach to something like tube amp design has more saturation, more distortion happening kind of in the preamp circuit and might get a little bit more front-loaded. And a lot of more modern guitar amp designs can give you high amounts of distortion, high amounts of saturation, no matter how hard or softly you are digging in. And they can be really, really consistent. And that can be a somewhat more modern approach to getting guitar sounds, but also to record making in general. And one of the many reasons that a lot of people like multiple stages of compression on something like a lead vocal is to make their tonal shape and envelope a little bit more consistent, so that we're not getting really significant tonal changes as the singer starts to really belt more and getting significant tonal changes as they start to be a little bit more quiet. Getting a more even vocal sound, getting a more even guitar sound, those are often things that we're shooting for in lots of modern styles of music production. It's not the only way to go, but that is the answer. Know the principles at play and make the choice you're going for based on your knowledge of those principles and what you're hearing. So when you are hearing saturation, if you're actually hearing your saturation and you're hearing it shift in tonal character as a player or a singer gets louder and quieter, ask yourself, is that what I want? Or do I want to be more consistent? If you want to be more consistent, you put the compressor before. If you want there to be more tonal variation in the amount of saturation, depending on how hard someone's digging in, then you put the compressor afterwards. I would say in most more modern styles of music production, you're probably going to be compressing before most types of saturators. There can be, though, modern digital saturators that are designed to give you a pretty similar level of distortion or saturation, no matter how hard you're hitting them. So that's something else to be aware of. But most old school analog designs and plugins that are modeled after old school analog processors are generally going to saturate more the more signal you're feeding into them. So I hope that makes sense. But probably the most popular question around this is, EQ, before or after compression? And the answer there is simple. Yes. EQ before or after compression, yes. You can have EQ before compression, you can have EQ after compression, and in some cases, you'll want both EQ before compression and EQ after compression. It depends a little bit, but in general, when you are making significant corrective cuts eliminating things from a signal with EQ that you want to get rid of, it often makes sense to do that before you hit a compressor or limiter. The most obvious example here is low end. For example, there's a guitar or a bass or a kick drum or a vocal that just has too much bottom end in it. Since bottom end needs a lot of amplitude, a lot of level to be audible, it can often end up being just about the only thing triggering your compressor. And if you know you want to get rid of some of that bottom end, you're going to want to get rid of it first before you hit the compressor, so that you don't have a whole bunch of bottom end triggering your compressor that you're then getting rid of. Imagine this example. You have a kick drum or a bass in a mix, and you're EQing an entire mix because you're at the mastering stage, and you want to pull out some of the low end in this kick or this bass because it's just too much. It sounds too woofy, too muddy, too overwhelming. So you need to take out some stuff 100 hertz and below, and you're going to EQ it down fairly significantly. You're going to want to do that before the compressor, because if you put the compressor on first in the chain before the EQ, that compressor is going to be responding to that overly bassy kick drum or bass. It's going to be sucking down, say, whenever that kick drum hits. And now your whole mix is sucking down every time that kick drum hits. And then after it, you're removing a whole bunch of the kick drum that was sucking down the whole mix. Doesn't really make any sense. Probably isn't going to be what you're going for, is probably going to give you weird, counterintuitive results. So generally speaking, you want to remove something, you want to do corrective EQ to take away stuff. That should often go before a compressor. The same idea works with sounds that are really bright. Say you have some drum overheads or drum room mics that are just too bright. They have too much treble on them, and these cymbals are really triggering your compressor or limiter. Subtracting, bringing down some of those high frequencies or upper mid frequencies that are just too overwhelming first before it even hits the compressor, it's going to keep those cymbals from over triggering that compressor, and then the signal gets compressed after that. So you don't have a compressor that's over responding to signals that you're ultimately getting rid of or reducing significantly. Now, that said, after you've done that, after you have a sound that you really like and it is compressed, and now you want to do some general overall enhancement to it, brighten up the tops, make the bottom end a little bit bigger, it often makes sense to do that after the compressor. Because if you have a sound that's already good, whether you did that with some corrective EQ or it just came in sounding naturally good already before you even touched it, and now you've added some compression to it for either tone or dynamic control or both, and now you want to bring some enhancement to it, you want to add the bottom, you want to add the top. If you put that kind of EQ before the compressor, you're going to end up changing how that compressor is triggered. And now, instead of responding to that overall good sounding, well-balanced signal, you're going to bring up the lows and highs going into the compressor. And now all of a sudden, the compressor is going to be responding more and more, compressing, bringing down those same very lows and highs that you just boosted. So that's a counterintuitive thing about boosting into a compressor. If you're applying a big boost to the lows, big boost to the highs, now those things are coming up significantly. Well, it's now going into a stage, a compressor, that's going to bring down the loudest stuff, which may now be some of those lows or highs or whatever it is that you boosted. So generally speaking, corrective cuts where you're taking things away go better before compressors, and generally speaking, boosts, particularly significant boosts that are really meant to enhance or to dazzle, tend to do better coming after compressors. After you've already got the dynamics smoothed out, now you're taking these smooth dynamics and just adding a little bit of shine or interest or bite or whatever it is you're looking for to the sound. So once again, think about the principle, listen to what you're hearing, and this is a question you can end up answering for yourself, just as Eric almost started to answer in his own question. Couple more I want to go through here while we're still on the theme of compression. What about limiters and compressors? Which should come first, a compressor or a limiter? Or if you're stacking compressors and taking my advice that I give about stacking compressors, using a slower attack compressor and a faster attack compressor together, which of those should come first, the faster attack compressor or the slower attack compressor? There is no one right answer to this. It depends a little bit on the program material. But just for a moment, let's talk about the context of mix bus or mastering. And in mastering, it would be somewhat common to use a limiter. It's probably one of the more important tools in mastering, along with an EQ. And it's fairly common to use a compressor. The way my signal chain often goes in mastering is my EQs come first. So I'm generally not doing really big boosts, and I'm generally doing some subtractive stuff in there, and then going into a compressor after I've kind of reduced some of the problem areas and done just modest enhancement. So after that EQ might come the compressor, and then after that compressor might come the limiter. So the compressor is kind of working A for tone a little bit, and maybe B doing a little bit of kind of averaging dynamic control. And then all of the peaks and the kind of leveling up that needs to be done is happening afterwards with the limiter. But in fairly organic mixes that are dynamically uncontrolled, it often makes sense to use two compressors. And in that case, I'm likely to put my fast attack compressor first because it's going to catch some of the peaks that will then not trigger the slower attack, more averaging compressor that comes afterwards. And this same concept can apply to mixing as well. One of the classic compressor combinations, 1176, often, exclusively very fast attack times on that compressor. And then after that, an LA2A, they have attack times more like 10 milliseconds, so arguably medium or even slow, depending on the kind of source. So for me, my default thinking is, well, if I put something like a fast attack 1176 compressor first, that is catching peaks. So now we're overloading the kind of more averaging slow compressor a little bit less. And this way, I feel like I can get slightly more transparent results because I'm getting slightly more consistent results out of something like an old school opto compressor, which can have a varying degree of character depending on how hard it's being hit. So shaving off a little bit with one compressor before going into that second character compressor, often a good idea. Now, with that said, a lot of people do it the other way around. They don't mind some of the variation in character from an old school tube compressor or an opto compressor. And then after that, they're putting a limiter just to catch the peaks and kind of smooth out excesses in level and transients and kind of make up for any work that earlier, slower character compressor wasn't doing. Neither of those are wrong, but it is similar to that question about which comes first, compression or saturation. And to me, that question comes down to which compressor do you want to be working less hard? And generally speaking, that one is going to come second. I've given you my general approach, but based on the exact same kind of reasoning I'm giving you, some people do exactly the opposite and also get really good sounds. So either way is 100% fine. And people in the comments down below will probably tell me they do the exact opposite as their default and they love doing it that way. And that is totally fine. And one of the things with this before and after which one comes first is the kinds of differences we are talking about are often really subtle. We're not talking about huge differences that are going to make or break your record. We're talking about small, subtle changes that are going to make your tools react a little bit more or a little bit less like the way that you expect them to. You're going to get results that are either slightly more consistent or slightly more varying in tone. Not huge, major things, but still things to think through, if only so you don't constantly second guess yourself and your approach in the mix, because that's going to bum you out and stop you from doing your best work. All right, another one that's really closely related before we move on to it's probably my favorite one, which is EQ and reverb before or after. But this one is de-essers and compressors. Really similar concept here. Should the de-esser come first because we want to make the de-esser that's just softening our S's and T's? Maybe it's a broadband de-esser. When an S or T hits, it's bringing everything down. Or maybe it's a frequency-specific de-esser that's just bringing down high frequencies whenever they get out of control. But either way, do we want to put that first so that these excessive S's and T's and excessive transients don't over-trigger our main compressor? Well, this one's a little bit of a trick. Usually it's going to be the other way around, because what makes S's and T's pop out on a vocal is the fact that you're compressing a vocal with a compressor that is too slow to catch those S's and T's. Or maybe the vocal is full-bodied sounding enough that the compressor is so busy reacting to lower and mid-frequency sounds that's not recovering in time for those to catch the S's and the T's. But either way, your main compressor is not catching the S's and T's, and then is bringing the level of everything up, including those S's and T's that it didn't catch. So here we don't really have that problem of, oh, do we want to smooth out this signal first before it gets to the compressor so it doesn't over-trigger the compressor with the S's and T's? No, the reason you have a problem with your S's and T's is because that compressor isn't touching them at all. And here, again, either can work. You can put the de-esser before, or you can put it after. With that said, I used to put it before, but I've found more and more that the de-essers to me just seem to work better when I put them after. They're just easier and more intuitive to set that way because I'm feeding them a signal where the S's and T's are popping out a lot because everything else has been compressed except the S's and T's. The problem has been magnified now before it even hits the de-esser. And that makes it so much easier to set an appropriate threshold on the de-esser. Because I'm taking a problem that's now exaggerated and saying, okay, let me find an answer to this relatively easy to solve problem because these S's and T's are so loud compared to the average of the vocal because all of them were missed and went through the compressor totally uncompressed. Whereas if I put the de-esser before the compressor, now I have a much smaller magnitude problem and a much more subtle puzzle to try to fix. Okay, I've got to set things just right so I'm catching these S's and T's that haven't been brought up yet in the hopes that after they get through the compressor, I'll have brought them down enough beforehand that they're not too loud afterwards. And to me, it just doesn't work quite as well as putting the de-esser after the compressor, where I have this big, high magnitude problem to solve that's just easier to fiddle around with and correct because the problem area is so high above the rest of the signal that I'm just so much less likely to accidentally set the de-esser in such a way where it ends up clamping down on things that it shouldn't be clamping down on. So generally speaking, de-essers work better after compressors. I hope that one makes sense to you. The other big thing here that comes up is EQing reverbs and delays potentially as well. One of the big things that separates just okay mixes from really great mixes is appropriate use of effects. And two of the biggest things that beginning mixers forget to do or don't realize that they should be doing is number one, using pre-delays on the reverbs, which allows the reverb sound to separate from the initial dry sound, thereby letting you use less reverb and have it be just as audible, leaving less clutter in your mix while still being able to hear that reverb sound and without taking the sound that you're applying the reverb to and without bringing it too far backwards in the mix. But the other thing that a lot of people don't do is they don't EQ their reverb sends or returns. And often beginning mixers end up with overly bright reverbs relative to their favorite mixes. And oftentimes just taking a little bit of top end off of that vocal reverb or snare drum reverb or whatever reverb you have is going to make it sit in the mix in a much better way where it doesn't become too overly apparent. And in general, when you are cutting top end out of a reverb, it's generally fine to do that on the reverb return. So a lot of reverbs will have built in an EQ where you can EQ before and after. You're using a digital reverb plugin, and then you can just EQ the reverb return, what's coming back, and just make that overall reverb less bright, doing it after the reverb. If you're using a reverb that doesn't have an EQ built in, you can just put an EQ plugin on after the reverb. But things change a little bit when we're talking about low frequencies. For example, there are some cases in which you might want to apply reverb to a kick drum or a bass. It's not as common or as heavy-handed as on other elements. Or there might be some relatively low instruments like low toms or a guitar that has a fair amount of bottom end in it. And you may need to apply some reverb or delay to those instruments. Not always, but sometimes. And the problem here is that if you try to get rid of some of the excess low end out of the reverb that's cluttering up your mix, you're not necessarily solving the problem of mix clutter. Because imagine, say in this mix, you want to have a kick drum that has some reverb on it, that has some kind of space and ambience around it. But there's just too much low end in that reverb that's making the mix murky and making the kick sound indistinct and making everything else sound indistinct. But you still need this effect on it. Well, if you have all of the low end of that kick drum going into the reverb, then that low end sound inside the reverb is going to be creating reverb in higher frequency harmonics. So even though you're cutting the lowest frequencies out of the reverb after the reverb, you're not stopping those lowest frequencies from getting into the reverb to begin with. So you're still adding a whole bunch of extra unwanted clutter further up in the audible spectrum that you're not EQing out. So in those cases, when you are having too dark of a reverb that has too much bottom end, that sounds too murky, it often makes sense to cut low end before you even hit that reverb. So that's another thing to think about. In general, when you want to make a reverb or a delay darker, just shaving off some top end from the reverb return, great way to go. But when you have a reverb that has too much bottom end, is too muddy, often EQing out some of those low frequencies or problem frequencies on the reverb send before you even hit the reverb is the way to go. And a lot of modern reverb plugins have that ability built into them. And if not, you can just put an EQ before your reverb plugin and handle it that way if you're using a send and return. Now, this answer about how to EQ before or after reverbs and delays takes us full circle, because these same principles get applied to whether you should EQ before or after saturation and distortion. Generally speaking, if you are getting too much high end in your saturation or distortion, then just reducing some of that high frequency stuff after the saturator can be totally fine. But if you have a whole bunch of low frequency energy that is causing your saturator to overreact just on certain notes, then cutting out some of those lows before you hit the saturator is a good idea. And doesn't that sound really similar to the principle we talked about before with EQing before or after the compressor? Those are related too, with some subtle differences. Do you disagree with any of the stuff I've said here about order of operations? Are there any specific effect groupings or pairings that I've missed? Do you have a different way of doing this stuff? Let me know in the comments down below, or if you prefer to email me, you always can over at podcast@sonicscoop.com. I read every one of those and every one of the comments that comes in here on YouTube as well. So I'll be looking forward to your questions, comments, and input on this one. Just a couple of quick notices before we wrap things up for the day. If you want to check out that full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs, I highly recommend it. It will change the way that you mix forever, for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. You can get at mixingbreakthroughs.com. We've had thousands of students take it, and it really does increase your creativity and confidence in mixing, making your finishing rate go up while your time to complete each mix goes down. Getting better quality and better results in less time, is that possible? Absolutely. And we have countless testimonials to prove it. If you're having trouble hearing some of these subtle kinds of variations we're talking about around things like compressors, limiters, and de-essers, I also have another course for you that you might want to check out, the full-length course Compression Breakthroughs, which you can get at compressionbreakthroughs.com. Also a 30-day money-back guarantee on that one. It will change the way that you hear and use compression forever, for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. Or if you want to learn everything that I know about mastering, you can check out my full-length course on mastering, Mastering Demystified, over at masteringengineer.com. Last but not least, quick shout out to our brand sponsors for this week, Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Also, Focusrite. I'm speaking into a wonderful Claret interface right now. Like their Scarlet and Red line of interfaces, it comes with the Hitmaker expansion bundle, which gives you all the plugins you need to make great sounding records, including channel strips and mastering chains from Brainworks, great amp plugins, vocal tuning software, a stellar reverb from Relab, virtual drums, and a whole lot more. Check out everything they make over at Focusrite.com. And also, the early access period over at GPU Audio is going to be coming to an end soon. If you still want to get a free convolution reverb from those guys before your time is up, check it out over at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop for a free convolution reverb that runs on the GPU inside your computer. All right, thanks for hanging out with me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.